Hi, welcome back. In this lecture, we will go through part 1 of the trending analysis, where we will walk through the 5-year trends for both Walmart and Amazon. On this slide, I created a chart where I compared Amazon and Walmart's revenues over the last 5 years. First, we can see that Amazon's revenues was $107 billion in fiscal 2015. In contrast, we can see that Walmart's revenues was substantially higher at around $478 billion in fiscal 2016. In comparison, Amazon's revenues 5 years ago was only around 22% of Walmart's total revenues for that year. Next, we can see that Amazon's revenues went up to $280.5 billion in fiscal 2019. For Walmart, we can see that their revenues was still higher at approximately $520 billion in fiscal 2020. In terms of size, we can see that Amazon's revenues is now around 54% the size of Walmart's revenues in fiscal 2019 and 2020. The key point here is that in terms of pure gross dollars, Walmart is still larger than Amazon in terms of revenues. However, an important point is that we can see Amazon Hi, and welcome back. In this lecture, we will go through part 2 of the trending analysis, where we will continue to walk through the 5-year trends for both Amazon and Walmart. On this slide, I took Amazon's statement of operations from its 10K filing, and I combined the data over the last 5 years. I then compared the dollar and percentage change from 2015 and 2019 to see what the 5-year trend looks like. Starting with net sales, we can see that from 2015 to 2019, sales have increased for Amazon by $173.5 billion. This translates to a 165% increase in net sales. This growth is remarkable since it has more than doubled its revenues in just the last 5 years. Next, we can see that operating income has increased from $2.2 billion in 2015 to $14.5 billion in 2019. This translates to a staggering 551% growth in operating income. Here, we can see that net income increased from $596 million to $11.6 billion. In other words, net income grew 19 times the amount from 2015, or 1,844% over the last 5 years alone. Then next, we see basic earnings per share, or EPS for short, go up from $1.28 per share to $23.46 per share. This translates to a growth of more than 1,700% for both the basic and diluted earnings per share. Overall, we can see that Amazon has experienced significant growth over the last 5 years. Now on this slide, I did a similar exercise and I took Walmart's statement of operations from their Form 10K filing. It was quite telling actually, once we compare the results of Amazon's growth versus what Walmart has experienced as a trend over the last 5 years. Starting with net sales, we can see that from fiscal 2016 to 2020, sales have increased for Walmart by $41.3 billion. This translates to a growth rate of around 9% in net sales. Although this is a healthy growth rate by all standard measures, we can see that 9% growth is only a fraction of the 165% growth experienced by Amazon over the same period in its net sales amount. Next, looking at the operating income line item, we can see that operating income has actually decreased by $3.5 billion. Specifically, operating income went down from $24.1 billion to $20.6 billion over the last 5 years. This translates to a decline of 15% in operating income. Moving on to the next key item, we can see that net income has stayed relatively flat over the last 5 years for Walmart. We can see that their net income has stayed below $15 billion annually and has only grown by 1% from fiscal 2016 and 2020. Next, we can see basic earnings per share go up from $4.58 per share to $5.22 per share. This translates to a growth of around 14% for both basic and diluted EPS. Hi, and welcome back. In this lecture, we will go through part 3 of the trending analysis, where we will walk through the year-over-year trends for both Amazon and Walmart. On this slide, I charted Amazon and Walmart's year-over-year revenue growth over the last 5 years. First, we can clearly see on this graph that Amazon has had significant growth every year when it comes to its revenues. Over the last 5 years alone, It has revenue growth ranging from 20% to almost 31% on a year-over-year annual basis. Next, we can see that Walmart's annual revenue growth over the last few years on this chart. The growth is quite minimal and is in line with inflation, ranging from less than 1% for certain years to around 3% for other years. The main point is that it is quite clear on this chart on how much more quickly Amazon is growing its revenues over the last few years. Simply put, Amazon has had significant growth on a year-over-year basis. This slide now includes the year-over-year operating income percentage growth for both Amazon and Walmart over the last few years. Starting with Amazon, we can see that they have had quite a bit of fluctuation in terms of year-over-year operating income growth. For instance, they have had some years with minimal growth, but other years, such as in fiscal 2018, when they had over 200% growth in operating income alone. Moving on to Walmart, we can see that Walmart's operating income did not grow anywhere as much as Amazon. For instance, Amazon did have a good year in fiscal 2019, but it also had some bad years, such as in fiscal 2018, where their operating income actually went down by 10%. Again, the main point here is that it is easy to see now how much more growth Amazon has had over the last few years. And on this slide, I also charted the net income percentage growth over the last 5 years for both companies. Starting with Amazon, this illustrates that Amazon's net income percentage growth is nothing short of amazing. For instance, it has had 2 years over the last 5 years where net income has grown more than 100% on a year-over-year basis. Now looking at Walmart, we can see that Walmart actually had some good years, but it's also had a decline in net income versus the prior years in other years. However, it is notable to see that Walmart did have a large increase in net income in fiscal 2020. So to summarize again, once we charted the year-over-year growth for both companies, it becomes clear on just how much more growth Amazon has experienced over the last few years in comparison to Walmart. Welcome back. In this lecture, we will go through part 4 of the trending analysis, where we will continue to walk through the year-over-year trends for both Amazon and Walmart. On this slide, I took Amazon's P&L from their Form 10-K filing, and I combined the data over the last 5 years. I then compared the percentage change to see the trend on a year-over-year basis. Starting with net sales, we can see that Amazon has experienced year-over-year growth between 20 and 30%. This is significant growth, and we can see that they are seeing increases for both their product sales and service sales. Next, we can see that the growth in their operating income has fluctuated year over year. For instance, we can see growth of 200% in 2018, whereas it was relatively flat from 2017 and 2018. However, from a trending perspective, Amazon is moving in the right direction, and overall, they are still seeing substantial growth in their operating income. Next, looking at the net income trend, we can see that net income growth has fluctuated from almost 300% in some years to just over 15% in other years. Overall, however, we can see that there is still substantial growth in net income on a year-over-year annual basis. The next line items we see here is the growth in earnings per share. For the most part, this follows the same pattern as the year-over-year growth that we observed for net income above. The key point on this slide is that we can see, based on our horizontal analysis, that Amazon has experienced significant growth on a year-over-year basis. Now let's see how Walmart looks. Similar to the previous slide, on this section, I have taken and combined Walmart's P&L from their Form 10-K filing. There are a few key observations and trends that we can see from Walmart. Starting with net sales, we can see that Walmart's sales has experienced minimal year-over-year growth. For the most part, net sales are increasing in line with inflation rates. Here, we can see that the change in operating income has fluctuated year over year. For instance, we can see that operating income decreased in 2018 by 10.2% versus the prior year. In contrast, we can see growth in 2019 of around 7.4%. Overall, however, we can see that operating income has decreased for Walmart over the last 5 years. Next, we can see the trend for net income, and we'll notice from fiscal 2017 and 2019, we can see that net income has declined from a range of 7% to 32% year over year. Overall, we can see that net income is flat, and the $14.9 billion of net income in 2020 is almost the same as Walmart's net income in fiscal 2016. The next line item here is the year-over-year change in earnings per share, or EPS for short. This follows the same pattern as the trends that we observed for net income above, and we can see declines in earnings per share from 2017 to 2019 for Walmart. Hi, and welcome back. In this lecture, we will go through part 5 of the trending analysis, where we will continue to walk through the year-over-year trends for both Amazon and Walmart. So starting on this table, I included the total assets for both Walmart and Amazon and charted those over the last 5 years. Here we can see in 2015 and 2016, Amazon had approximately $67 billion of total assets, whereas Walmart had around $199.6 billion of total assets. In other words, Amazon had approximately 34% of total assets relative to Walmart's size at that time. Then moving forward to fiscal 2019 and 2020, we can see that Amazon's total assets has increased significantly over the last 5 years and is now up to around $225.2 billion. And then Walmart's is around $236.5 billion. So in other words, Walmart or Amazon is now around 95% of Walmart's size when you compare total assets. On this table, we have total equity for both Amazon and Walmart. And here we can see the equity amount for Amazon was $13.4 billion back in 2015. And for Walmart, it was around $80.5 billion in fiscal 2016. In other words, Amazon was approximately 17% of equity in Walmart's size. Now, fast forward to fiscal 2019-2020, we can see that Amazon had approximately $62.1 billion of equity, and Walmart's equity actually went down over the last few years to $74.7 billion. So you take this as a comparison of size, we can see that Amazon, based on its equity, is now approximately 83% the size of Walmart. Here I've included the balance sheet for Amazon. Starting with total assets, we can see on a year-over-year basis that Amazon's assets has gone up from $162.6 billion in 2018 up to $225.2 billion in 2019. On the liabilities and equity side, we can see the liabilities for Amazon on this section of the balance sheet. And then we can see the equity portion. And the key item to highlight here is we can see that Amazon's stockholders' equity has actually gone up quite significantly in just the 1 year, from $43.5 billion and now up to $62.1 billion. Now for Walmart, did a similar exercise where I've now included the asset side of Walmart's balance sheet. And we can see that on a year-over-year basis, Walmart's balance sheet, their assets has gone up from $219.3 billion to $236.5 billion for fiscal 2020. And then on the liability side, we can see the year-over-year trends here. But more importantly, we can see the change in shareholders' equity for Walmart. And here you can see that shareholders' equity for Walmart has hovered around $79 to $81 billion in just the last 2 years. So unlike what we saw with Amazon, there hasn't been a lot of fluctuations or movements in its equity value. In this section, we'll go through a scorecard for the trending analysis of Amazon and Walmart. Starting with the pure gross dollar values, we saw that Amazon, in its most recent fiscal year, had revenues of around $280.5 billion, whereas Walmart had revenues of around $523.9 billion. So in that case, from a pure dollar value perspective, Walmart would have the advantage. Moving on to operating income, we saw that Amazon had generated $14.5 billion of operating income in its most recent year, whereas Walmart generated $20.6 billion of operating income in fiscal 2020. So again, the advantage would go to Walmart from a pure dollar perspective. Moving on to net income, we see that Amazon's net income was $11.6 billion, whereas Walmart generated $14.9 billion in its most recent year. So there, the advantage again would go to Walmart from a pure gross dollar amount. Now, when we move on to earnings per share, we notice that Amazon had $23.46 of basic EPS, whereas Walmart generated $5.22 earnings per share on a basic perspective. So the advantage would go to Amazon. And then we had the diluted earnings per share, which was $23.01 for Amazon and $5.19 for Walmart. So again, the advantage would go to Amazon. So going back to pure gross dollar amounts, when we look at the operating cash flows of both companies, we see that Amazon generated $38.5 billion of operating cash flows, whereas Walmart generated $25.3 billion. So from a pure dollar perspective, Amazon would have the advantage in that regard. Now, looking at assets, we had total assets of $225.3 billion for Amazon and $236.5 billion for Walmart. So Walmart in this case has a larger total asset balance. And looking at liabilities, we notice that Amazon had $163.2 billion of total liabilities, whereas Walmart had approximately the same amount, but slightly lower at $161.8 billion. So Walmart would have the advantage there because it has slightly lower liabilities. And then from an equity side, we see that Amazon had $62.1 billion of shareholders' equity, and Walmart had $74.7 billion. So Walmart would take the advantage there. So this is just pure gross dollar values. So more interestingly, let's move over to the 5-year growth trend analysis. So when we look at the 5-year percentage growth, we notice that Amazon increased its revenues 162% over a 5-year period, whereas Walmart increased its revenues by around 9%. So the advantage would go to Amazon. And then when you look at the operating income growth based on our trending analysis, we notice that Amazon had a 551% growth, whereas Walmart actually had a negative 15% decline in operating income over a 5-year period. So the advantage would go to Amazon. And now when we look at net income, the numbers were even larger as we saw earlier. And from a 5-year growth perspective, Amazon's net income increased by 1,844% over the last 5 years alone, whereas Walmart was actually pretty flat at around 1%. And then when you take earnings per share, when you have basic EPS, we had growth of around 1,733% over 5 years for Amazon, whereas it only grew around 14% for Walmart. And similarly for EPS diluted basis, we had 1,741% for Amazon, and Walmart had a 14% growth over 5 years. So again, the advantage on a pure 5-year percentage growth all goes to Amazon. And last but not least, let's look at it and summarize the year-over-year growth that we saw earlier. Starting with revenues, we saw that Amazon had revenue growth of 20.5% to 30.9% on a year-over-year basis, whereas Walmart had revenue growth some years of around 0.6% up to 3%. So there, Amazon would take the cake on the revenues side. For operating income, we see that Amazon actually had a slight decline of 1.9% in 1 year, but then it had growth of over 200% in another year. Whereas for Walmart, they had some years where you had a decline of 10.2%, and then it went up to 7.4% on some years year over year. But overall, the advantage would go to Amazon. Now moving on to net income, we saw 15% growth in some years up to 297.8%, almost 300% for Amazon year over year. And then for Walmart, we actually saw significant fluctuations where in some years they had a decline of 32.4%, and then in other years they had a large increase in net income of 123%. But overall, when you look at the min and max, it would still go to Amazon. Now let's go to the per share amount. Basic EPS. Some growths were 13.4% up to 291% for Amazon, whereas for Walmart, EPS declined some years by almost 31% and then up other years to almost 129%. But again, when you look at this from a min and max perspective and year over year, the advantage would go to Amazon. And last but not least, you go through diluted EPS. For Amazon, we had 14% in one year and 292% in another year. And then for Walmart, we had a decline of 31.1% in one year and an increase of 129.6% in another year. But overall, Amazon would take this advantage. So there, that summarizes this section. And you can see from a pure dollar perspective, yes, Walmart still has larger revenues and total asset amounts. But when you look at from a pure growth perspective, whether it's on a year over year basis or over a 5-year trend, we can see that Amazon has just experienced this remarkable growth over the last few years.